to connect a region of over 600 million bridges between our lands.
Good evening, I'm Alma Angeles, and you're watching ASEAN in Focus. On tonight's headlines. A 7.1 magnitude earthquake rattled residents on islands west of Indonesia's Sumatra today, forcing them to flee to higher ground before an hours-long tsunami warning was lifted. Late word for a 72-hour ceasefire, another attempt to stop Sudan from spiraling into a civil war as two rival generals battle for control, leaving thousands stranded in the war zone. And the DFA says at least 69 Filipinos have evacuated from Sudan as widespread violence rages on. Beijing's defense ministry said China and Singapore will hold joint naval drills this week. And President Marcos Jr. vows to fulfill the needs of the Filipino athletes, coaches, plus sports officials bound for the 32nd Southeast Asian Games in Cambodia. First in our news, a 7.1 magnitude earthquake rattled residents on islands west of Indonesia's Sumatra today, forcing them to flee to higher ground before an hours-long tsunami warning was lifted. The epicenter of the quake, which struck at 3 a.m. local time, was in the sea near the Mentawai Islands at a depth of 15.5 kilometers, according to the USGS. No casualties or severe damage were reported. The quake was so strong that we struggled to stand up and walk outside. We were struggling to get out of the house. We had to hold on to the walls, according to Patrice Sanene, a 34-year-old resident of Siberut, Mentawai's largest island. Indonesia's Geophysical Agency, or BMKG, issued a tsunami warning that lasted around 2 hours after initially reporting a higher quake magnitude of 7.3. BMKG Chief Daryono said there were several aftershocks, and residents said they were jolted awake by the shaking and rushed outside. Officials said the quake was also felt in the coastal city of Padang in western Sumatra, which is around 200 kilometers from the epicenter. Indonesia experiences frequent earthquakes due to its position on the Pacific Ring of Fire, an arc of intense seismic activity where tectonic plates collide. And another story making headlines around the world. Late word for a 72-hour ceasefire and another attempt to stop Sudan from spiraling into civil war as two rival generals battle for control, leaving thousands stranded in the war zone. There are no U.S. plans for mass rescue mission. The U.S. Embassy is urging its citizens instead to shelter in place or find safety if they can at their own risk.
We've continued to be in close communication with U.S. citizens and individuals affiliated with the U.S. government to provide assistance and facilitate available departure routes for those seeking to move to safety via land, air, and sea. This includes Americans who are traveling overland in the UN convoy from Khartoum to Port Sudan. We're taking further steps to support Americans and are exploring options to return a diplomatic and consular presence to Sudan as soon as possible.
Meanwhile, the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs said 3 Filipino flight attendants of Saudia were the first Filipino workers to be evacuated from Sudan. And this came as the Philippine Embassy in Cairo has dispatched a bus going to the border with Sudan to fetch the Filipinos fleeing from the civil war.
Making sure that those who have those who are able to cross the border would be given financial assistance upon crossing, kasi marami sa kanila wala talagang dala at all. And may mga bata din kasi. Spoke with one group that is just waiting for their bus, and ang kasamahan nila mga 20 na mga bata, including a 7-month-old baby. So the president's directives were, number 1, to get all of them to safety as quickly as possible. Number 2, it shouldn't matter whatever papers they have, or if they don't have any papers at all, to quote the President, kung marunong mag-Tagalog, marunong mag-Bisaya, marunong mag-Ilocano, marunong ng iba't ibang dialect sa atin, Pinoy yan. So we will help, and doesn't really matter if they are in possession of a passport or any identity card. We are looking at 3 exit points. One would be from Khartoum by land, and then exit via Aswan into Egypt. That's a land trip. The second one would be by land to Port Sudan, and then
Germany, Italy, France, the Philippines, Japan, Spain, UK, and others have managed to get their citizens out the best way they can, but thousands remain.
We managed to make it out of Khartoum, and we are here in Port Sudan, which is in the eastern part of Sudan, and trying to figure out what our next steps are. It's a horrible situation to be in. We've been made homeless, displaced, over something that has nothing to do with us as Sudanese. It's between 2 men and their heavily weaponized armies. But we're paying the really, really heavy price. I personally don't know what to do. I keep changing my mind every minute. I want to stay, I want to leave.
A history in Australia as the military gears up for its biggest shakeup in decades. A review of its army has found it is outdated. It's too slow and can't buy or build new weaponry fast enough to keep up with modern demands. Take a look.
We confront the most challenging strategic circumstances since the Second World War, both in our region and indeed around the world. That's why we're investing in our capabilities and we're investing in our relationships to build a more secure Australia and a more stable and prosperous region. The scale and significance of the Defence Strategic Review and my government's response shows the strength of our determination to keep Australians safe.
While the review mentions China only 9 times and never as an adversary, there's little doubt that Beijing's vast military investment and increased saber rattling are a driving force behind the changes. This buildup is occurring without transparency or reassurance to the Indo-Pacific region of China's strategic intent, according to the review, using another term for the Asia-Pacific. China's assertion of sovereignty over the South China Sea threatens the global rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific in a way that adversely impacts Australia's national interests. Defense Minister Richard Marles unveiled a strategic review that called for a sharp shift toward long-range deterrence, using missiles, submarines, and cyber tools to keep adversaries at arm's length. In response to that threat, Australia's military will develop the ability to strike from air, land, and sea, strengthen northern bases, and recruit more troops.
This review and the government's response to it does provide for a reshaping of the Australian Army, but in a way which gives it a much greater strike capability and a much longer range strike capability. And the defence posture that we have had for the last few decades has served our nation well. But in the circumstances that we now face, that defence posture is no longer fit for purpose. And so today, for the first time in 35 years, we are recasting the mission of the Australian Defence Force.
Meanwhile, Beijing has returned fire after Australia unveiled plans to overhaul its armed forces. It accused the southern neighbor of hyping up a China threat as an excuse to expand its military. Let's listen in.
我想强调的是，中国始终奉行防御性的国防政策。我们致力于维护亚太和世界的和平稳定，不对任何国家构成威胁。我们希望一些国家扩张军力，不要拿中国做借口，不要炒作毫无根据的中国威胁论。
The independent review, led by former Chief of Defense Sir Angus Houston and former Defense Minister Stephen Smith, urged Australia to prepare its defense force for a possible conflict between China and the U.S. It named intense China-U.S. competition as the defining feature of our region and our time, saying major power competition had the potential to threaten Australia's interests, including through conflict. But the report also noted a stable relationship between Australia and China was in the interest of both countries and the broader region. Beijing's defense ministry said China and Singapore will hold joint naval drills this week. Now, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy will dispatch its frigate Yulin as well as the Chibi minesweeper for the drills, which will take place around Singapore from end April to early May, according to the ministry in a statement. The two countries agreed last year to hold the drills at a meeting of defense ministers, though details were not announced at the time. Singapore regularly conducts drills with countries from the region and around the world, with personnel from the city-state taking part in the massive Cobra Gold exercises with U.S. soldiers in Thailand in March. The announcement comes days after the U.S. commander of the Pacific Air Forces met with Singapore's Defense Minister Ng Eng Hen to discuss enhanced cooperation in military training. The Southeast Asian country has for decades juggled ties with rival powers in the region, engaging in an increasingly delicate balancing act as China asserts its might across the Asia-Pacific. Foreign ministers from Group of 7 industrialized nations warned this month against China's expansive maritime claims in the South China Sea, while tensions have soared in the Taiwan Strait, with Beijing brandishing its firepower in recent drills aimed at intimidating Taipei. China and Singapore have previously held naval exercises in the South China Sea, including multiple joint exercises back in 2021. In tonight's other news, the family of a Singaporean man due to be hanged next week over a kilogram of cannabis pleaded for clemency from the authorities Sunday and urged a retrial. Tangarahu Supia, 46, was sentenced to death in 2018 for conspiring to smuggle the drugs, and the Court of Appeal has upheld his sentence, which is scheduled to be carried out tomorrow, Wednesday.
As the international community has responded to the undeniable evidence and science about cannabis and harm reduction, moving decisively towards decriminalization, legalization, and regulation of the plant and its uses, it should outrage all Singaporeans to witness the grave injustices that Thangaraju and his family have suffered over the last 27 years. In addition to Thangaraju, there are at least 5 other men on death row at Changi Prison for cannabis-related charges.
சின்ன வயசுல இருந்து அவன் எல்லாருக்கிட்டையும் வந்து ரொம்ப அன்பா இருக்கிறாங்க. ஸோ அவனை பத்தி தப்பா சொல்றதுக்கு எதுவும் இல்லை. ஸோ இந்த குடும்பத்துக்காகவே அவன் ரொம்ப கஷ்டப்பட்டான். ஸோ அக்கா அக்கான்னு சொல்லி எனக்கே அவன் ரொம்ப கஷ்டப்பட்டான்.
It'll be Singapore's first execution in 6 months, and rights activists and family members say there were loopholes in the case and that Tangarahu never handled the drugs. They also claimed he was questioned by police without legal counsel and that he was denied a Tamil interpreter during the recording of his first police statement. Singapore's Central Narcotics Bureau said he had access to legal counsel throughout the process and that the judge found it disingenuous given Tangarahu's admission he had made no request for an interpreter for any of the other statements. Singapore resumed execution by hanging in March in 2022 after a hiatus of more than 2 years. 11 executions were carried out last year, all for drug offenses. In many parts of the world, including in neighboring Thailand, cannabis has been decriminalized, and rights groups have been mounting pressure on Singapore to abolish the capital punishment. The Asian financial hub has some of the world's toughest anti-narcotics laws and insists the death penalty remains an effective deterrent against trafficking. And today marks the second anniversary since ASEAN agreed on the 5-point consensus in response to the military coup in Myanmar. According to the Amnesty International, the Myanmar military has ignored calls from the international community to stop the violence. However, since the coup, the Myanmar military has committed war crimes and possible crimes against humanity. ASEAN leaders, it said, must step up and address the situation in Myanmar without further delay. Amnesty International has assessed ASEAN's 5-point consensus using concrete evidence as examples were relevant and highlights its failures. Meanwhile, strongly condemning the airstrikes on civilians by the military junta, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations demanded an immediate end to all forms of violence in Myanmar. The regional multinational bloc said all forms of violence must end immediately, particularly the use of force against civilians. Indonesia is the current chair of the 10-member bloc, and dozens of people were killed in the latest junta airstrikes in Myanmar last Tuesday, according to the unity government in exile. A statement by ASEAN said ending the violence would be the only way to create a conducive environment for an inclusive national dialogue to find a sustainable, peaceful solution in Myanmar. The UN Secretary General denounced the devastation caused by Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. This during a Security Council meeting chaired by Russia's foreign minister. Mr. Antonio Guterres said in front of Sergei Lavrov that the Russian invasion was a violation of international law.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, is causing massive suffering and devastation to the country and its people, and adding to the global economic dislocation triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Западные страны не только сохранили НАТО, но и, вопреки своим клятвенным обещаниям, взяли курс на наглое поглощение прилегающего пространства, включая территории, где всегда существовали и будут существовать жизненно важные интересы России.
As we sit here, Russian forces continue to kill and injure civilians. As we sit here, Russian forces are destroying Ukraine's critical infrastructure.
我们反对个别国家歪曲国际法含义，将自己的意志强加于国际社会，包装成所谓基于规则的国际秩序。
Russia holds the rotating presidency of the Security Council in April and organized the meeting as one of its signature events of its tenure. In a note to member states laying out the meeting, Russia denounced the unipolar world order that took effect after the end of the Cold War. It said that presented a serious challenge to the efficiency and stability of the UN system. In tonight's other news, India will overtake China as the world's most populous country in the coming week, hitting almost 1.43 billion according to the UN. And the UN said the main driver of these trends is the fertility level in the two populations. Let's listen in.
India is projected to overtake China as the world's most populous country during the current month, April of 2023. China's population reached its peak size of 1.4 million in 2022 and has begun to decline. Projections indicate that the size of the Chinese population could drop below 1 billion before the end of the century. In India, by contrast, the population is expected to continue growing for several decades. The main driver of these trends is the fertility level in the two populations. In 2022, China had one of the world's lowest fertility rates, which was 1.2 births per woman on average over a lifetime. India's current fertility rate, which is at 2.0 births per woman, is just below the replacement threshold of 2.1, which is the level required for population stabilization in the long run in the absence of migration. Well, the crossover reminds us that the number of older persons is growing rapidly. Between 2023 and 2050, the number of persons aged 65 or over is expected to nearly double in China and to more than double in India. These trends call attention to the challenges of providing social support and protection to growing numbers of older persons. Now is the time to think for the long term and to promote greater solidarity within societies and between generations. Central to this long-term planning are efforts to combat climate change. It is essential that increasing numbers of people and increasing incomes per capita in China, in India, and throughout the world do not undermine efforts to move towards more sustainable consumption and production.
The president's economic team doesn't consider the rise of COVID cases a threat to the country's recovery and said they believe that a lockdown is not even imminent. In a briefing, Finance Secretary Benjamin Diokno told reporters that there's nothing to fear, despite the recent report of the DOH that new cases increased by 20%. Let's listen in.
I don't think there will be another lockdown. Okay, they just issued the alert. Plus, the difference between the situation then and now is there are vaccines available, and there's a standard protocol for COVID cases. If you're sick, you just go to the hospital or drink something or just rest. Okay, so I don't think that's kind of scary. Okay, so I don't even think why you're wearing your mask here. Okay.
Meanwhile, the economic team also dispelled fears that an impending El Nino would lead to high inflation and disrupt the country's economic recovery. National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA Secretary Arsenio Balisacan said the government has been preparing its immediate plans to combat the ill effects of the dry spell.
We have already put in place, the President has created, as you may have known, the interagency Committee on Inflation and Market Outlook. No? That committee is mandated to tasked to monitor movements of prices, to anticipate the effects of things like El Nino and production, so that we can plan the appropriate response if we need to import more to cover any potential shortfalls in production. Then we would have to make that decision early on and not wait until the effects are already felt by our population.
Meanwhile, the Philippine economic team has maintained its growth targets for 2023 at 6.0% to 7%, while revising macroeconomic assumptions to reflect higher inflation and easing global oil price trends, according to the Department of Budget and Management.
Given recent developments in the domestic and global economy and the administration's near and medium-term priorities, with increased domestic demand along with better labor conditions, improved tourist turnout, and resumption of face-to-face classes, the Philippine economy grew by 7.6% in 2022, outperforming the DBCC's growth target of 6.5 to 7.5%. This high growth performance is projected to continue until 2028, aligned with the medium-term fiscal framework. Thus, we maintain our growth targets at 6% to 7% for 2023 to 6.5 to 8% for 2024 to 2028. This is in consideration of the risks posed by geopolitical and trade tensions, possible global economic slowdown, as well as weather disturbances in the country. In line with the Philippine Development Plan 2023-2028, the strategies of the government will focus on modernizing agriculture, expanding agribusiness, encouraging private sector participation in infrastructure development, promoting digital transformation, and enhancing the competitiveness of local industries, among others. The average inflation rate assumption for 2023 is increased to 5 to 7% from the previous assumption of 2.5 to 4.5%, given the persisting high prices of food, energy, and transport costs. Nevertheless, the government, through the Interagency Committee on Inflation and Market Outlook, is committed to pursuing an all-of-government approach to continuously implement immediate and medium-term strategies to alleviate inflation, ensure food and energy security, and return to the target range of 2 to 4% between 2024 and 2028. Meanwhile, the assumption for the price of Dubai crude oil for 2023 is lowered to 70 to 90 USD per barrel, considering the global demand slowdown. The latest forecast suggests that global crude oil prices will continue to decline in 2024 before stabilizing at 60 to 80 USD per barrel between 2025 and 2028, as the latest forecast suggests falling global crude oil prices over the medium term. Likewise, the peso-dollar exchange rate assumptions for 2023 were adjusted downwards to 53 to 57 USD and are expected to be maintained at the same level until 2028.
Meanwhile, the Bureau of Plant Industry has warned of a possible spike in prices and decrease of delivery of local vegetables and rice due to El Nino. Let's listen in.
Sa ngayon ho, may proyekto ho ang pamahalaan, lalo na po ang High Value Crops Development Program. Nandyan po yung mga drip irrigation na kung saan ang pagdidilig po ng tubig ay precise. Ibig sabihin po nito, ang naman po hindi labis at hindi kulang. Sa madaling salita, episyente po. Nandyan din po ang production support na dun po sa lugar na malubhang maapektuhan po ng El Nino, meron pong mga buffer stock po ng seeds para po sa replanting kung kinakailangan. At doon naman po sa mga lugar na inaasahang hindi lubhang maapektuhan ng El Nino, ay palalakasin po natin ang inyong produksyon upang masalo naman po yung mga lugi na galing po sa mga apektadong lugar.
And finally, in our news, President Marcos vowed that his administration is out to fulfill the needs of our Filipino athletes, coaches, and sports officials bound for the 32nd Southeast Asian Games in Phnom Penh. This during his speech in the send-off ceremony for SEA Games bound Team Philippines at the Philippine International Convention Center Reception Hall in Pasay. Let's listen in.
That sport is one of the very few activities. Iilan lang talaga ang pwede nating sabihin na ating ginagawa na walang downside. The only downside to sport is sometimes you get injured. Yun lang. Pinilit ko makapunta rito dahil gusto ko makilala yung mga champion. Kagaya ng sinabi ni Mayor, sabi niya ako, naging sport. Lahat na sinubukan ko. Nag-football ako, nag-squash ako, nag-shooting ako, nag-archery pa ako, nag-fencing pa ako. Hindi ako nag-champion. If there is anything more that this government can do, that this administration can do, that I personally can do, you please make sure you will tell me, because we are all rooting for you and we all want to do everything that we can do to make you as successful as you possibly can in your chosen events.
Philippine Sports Commission Chair Richard Bachman, for his part, said he will be in Phnom Penh to personally support the team from start to finish.
We use sports as an avenue to unite nations. So I would think actually his message to me basically is to improve us, the Philippines, in all sports, and also take care of the athletes.
As my usual habit, I'd like to end the day on a positive note. Let's encourage and build each other up so that no one is left behind. And that's it for tonight's broadcast. I'm Alma Angela. Stay in the news because we live in extraordinary times. Good night.